各位来宾，下午好，欢迎回到第10届网络社会年会。下午第一位发言嘉宾是尼克·蒙特福特教授，他是麻省理工学院教授。他的研究成果包括多部计算机生成的著作和数字的艺术项目。他的演讲主题是编码、点击与提示，声场艺术的方式。有请。
Yes. Thank you. Hi, thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me here at the 10th Network Society Conference. I'm going to speak about, oh my fonts have changed. That's okay. I'm going to speak today about different ways that people have and still have used computers to create art. And I am going to situate the use of generative AI, the prompting of systems based on, well, from my perspective as a writer, mostly LLMs, but also diffusion models and other models for visual art in this history. How have people used computers to make art? There are different ways to slice this up. We could talk about the interface, which is very important. Was it done using punch cards, paper tape? Was it done interactively? There are many different possibilities, but I'm going to choose this 5-part division. First, there's assembly language programming specific to a particular computer and an instruction set. Then there's programming in high-level languages. The kind that we're familiar with, Python, is very widespread today. Then the development and use of programming languages that are for art specifically. So processing is an example of these, but there's also MaximSP PD. And the development and use of applications for art. I think we all know of many of these. Photoshop would be a common example. And finally, there's training, tuning, and prompting generative AI, which is thematic for us today. So we'll start with examples from literary art, which is closest to my own practice and my own scholarship. This is from a 1952 computer program by Christopher Strachey done at Manchester University, Love Letters. His system output this: "Darling sweetheart, you are my avid fellow feeling. My affection curiously clings to your passionate wish. My liking yearns for your heart. You are my wistful sympathy, my tender liking. Yours beautifully, Manchester University Computer." Strachey wrote this. This is an image of the paper where he wrote his machine code. He wrote it out by hand and had it encoded, key punched, so that it could run on the machine. In the machine code that was specific to this machine, the Manchester Mark I, similar to the Ferranti Mark I. And he was actually using machine code, but assembly language would be developed around this time in many places around the world as an easier way to accomplish the same result, still at a very, very low level, still specific to different computers. As an example of high-level programming, here is a Fortran program's output, The House of Dust. This is from 1967, done by Alison Knowles Fluxus artist, and James Tinney, a composer. A house of broken dishes among small hills, using natural light, inhabited by little boys. A house of mud in a hot climate, using all available lighting, inhabited by French and German-speaking people. So Knowles and Tinney used what was a formula translation, mathematical programming language, for a rather strange purpose, to create an infinite poem about global experience and global inhabitants. And this is the way in which Fortran was programmed at the time. You can see at the top there's code, much like the basic programming code that's running on those computers behind you all. Now, I mentioned this very famous example of a text generator, a chatbot, Eliza Doctor from 1965 by Joseph Weizenbaum, not because it is the first chatbot, not because it is the predecessor of ChatGPT, but because it is a platform, it is a means of creating different computer characters. So Eliza was the system in which the Doctor script and other scripts could run. And Doctor was the script that specifically imitated a psychotherapist, so that when someone typed "men are all alike," it would reply, in what way? They're always bugging us about something or other. Can you think of a specific example? Well, my boyfriend made me come here. Your boyfriend made you come here. He says I'm depressed much of the time. I am sorry to hear that you're depressed. It's true, I'm unhappy. Do you think coming here will help you to not be unhappy? Now, this is actually the beginning of the Doctor script itself, and I don't ask you to look over it and analyze it, but you can see that it is not a computer program. It is a script, one of 3 that survive in archival materials. And with this ELIZA platform, it was possible to create different chatbots. So that's something that makes ELIZA not just a chatbot, but a platform for this type of literary art, computer characters. Now, I have never used Dramatica myself, but this program by Huntley and Phillips from 1994 is an application, much in the style of Photoshop, that allows writers to develop aspects of their story. You can see it has a graphical user interface, and it has different capabilities for writing and for plot developing. I'm going to read you some from this work because I think it's a really exemplary example of literary engagement with generative AI and LLMs. This is from Lillian Yvonne Bertram's "A Black Story May Contain Sensitive Content." Lillian Yvonne is a non-binary African-American writer and is interested in, well, among other things, the writings of Gwendolyn Brooks, a very famous American poet, but also in how the narratives of Black people, African-American people, might be represented by these systems. So here's what we have. GPT-3, tell me a Black story. Once upon a time, there was a Black family who lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere. They were the only Black family in the town, and they were always the last to get everything. The kids always had to sit in the back of the bus. The family always had to eat at the back of the restaurant, and they always had to live in the worst part of town. One day, the family decided they'd had enough. They packed up their things and moved to a big city where they could be around other Black people and be treated better. They never looked back. Now, we might say this story has some historical resonance. This, in fact, this type of thing did happen in the United States, but it's also not a very good story. It's very generic, it's very stereotypical, it's very safe. If we replace GPT-3 with a model that is not fine-tuned, but trained from scratch on the writings of Gwendolyn Brooks, her letters, essays, speeches, poems, we get something else. Warpland 2.0. Tell me a black story, and I will tell them a story about blacks. I know them very well, and I'm not afraid to say what I feel. I know that some of them are not going to like what I have to say, but I also know that some of them will like what I have to say. I can't imagine they can't. I tell them that they are beautiful. I tell them that they are wonderful and that they can go on the stage and they can go to the movies and that they can get very rich and they can get immortal. And they can do all these things if they just work hard and are not afraid. I tell them that some of them will be so great that they will be a part of a language and people will say, what does Auden mean when he says so-and-so? And people will say, why, he means exactly what so-and-so means. I tell them that they can be recognized and that they can be loved by everyone. I tell them that I love them and I respect them and that I admire their beautiful faces and their beautiful bodies. I tell them I am so happy that they are here. You can think about whether you find that more interesting than OpenAI's version. So Lillian Avan and I edited this book, Output, an anthology of computer-generated text, 1953 to 2023, starting with the very first selection is the love letter generator, and actually the last selection is Banner Poetry Depot 2000 by NYU Shanghai students, which we got in just before the December 2023 deadline for the book. And the book has 7 decades of computer-generated text. Of course, it's in English. It is in many genres, but it's not only poetry, literature, or creative work. It has other works as well. It'd be great if you were to read it, but you could also do what Alexander Sommer and Alexander Geffen are doing in Paris now, and you could do, just as they're doing a French version of Output, drawing on the work that's been done in the French language, you could also do an anthology of this sort that is in Chinese. So I'm next going to go quickly through some examples of how these 5 types of work have been done in the other arts, not just in the literary arts. Again, starting with assembly language programming, then programming in high-level languages that are created for general use, then the development and use of artistic programming language, then applications for art, how they're developed and used, and finally, generative AI. So it turns out that assembly language programming not only was used in very early projects, but also in some that are more recent, just from the last decade or so. On the PDP-8, which which you can see featured in a film at the festival. James Seawright did this project Network 3 in 1977 that responds interactively to people walking underneath it. And he programmed that in assembly language. Tristan Parrich's 1-bit symphony, this is a sound piece that comes in a CD case, but it's a piece of physical computing. So the sound and music that you get from it is generated live each time. And it's done using an Atmel processor that he coded. And then an amazing piece from the demo scene from 2017, Linus Åkesson's A Mind is Born, is a 256 byte Commodore 64 program that has sound and graphics. Okay, moving to higher level programming languages. So one of these that's fairly widely known in the arts is John F. Simon Jr.'s Every Icon. It's a project starting in 1997, the idea being that it would exhaustively go through over an extraordinarily long geological or cosmological period of time and fill in every possible icon that was described by this 32 by 32 grid. Unfortunately, in the meantime, support for the Java programming language has lapsed, so you can still run it on a computer if you hold back the updates, but he did write that in Java. And then George Nice, one of the first computer artists to exhibit work, did this 1972 piece here, for instance, Variation de Art Ex Machina in Algol, an interesting programming language that had keywords that actually could be substituted across human languages. So you could write a French version of the program, an English version, etc. And then I've shown you a program by Everest Pipkin from 2019. This is Ladder, and the program interprets between an image file and a text file. So it gives you a rendering of the image as words in that text file. And this is the entire code to the program, which is written in Node, command line version of JavaScript. So now we're moving up to platforms for creative production. And so I mentioned processing offhand, and the current version of processing that's usable and shareable on the web, processing is still updated actually, but because of restrictions, security restrictions on using Java in the browser, if you wanted to do something in processing and you wanted other people to see it online, you would want to use P5JS, the project that Lauren McCarthy began and Q Ye has continued, both of them at UCLA. This is a piece that apparently doesn't exist anymore, or that no one in the West has been able to find, but it's a piece that runs in Adobe Flash. And support for Adobe Flash ended in 2020, except I'm told in China, but I don't know about that. So Adobe Flash is also an interesting case of a system that didn't start out as a programming language. It started out as an animation system, and then ActionScript was added to it to allow people to program it. And I think similarly, Music 1, 2, 3, 4, and Groove by Max Matthews starts as the first synthesizer type of application, but then becomes more general of a platform. And so that work in sound is very significant. And when you get to Groove in 1970, although the number is hidden, Groove is a system for collaboration between a human musician and a computer. And all right, when we get to Forward, we start now talking about applications. And we know many of these. We know Photoshop and GIMP and Illustrator and Inkscape, Final Cut Pro, and After Effects and so on. But I want to also highlight Blender, which came out of a studio starting in 1994, a studio called Neo Geo, nothing to do with the video game console, and has become a tool for 3D modeling and is a free Libre open source system. Then one of the most significant early graphics applications was Sketchpad that Ivan Sutherland did in 1963, and it was for technical drawing, but this really is the ancestor of things like Illustrator and Inkscape, where you're able to do vector graphics drawing, you're able to shrink and grow and skew each of the figures. Some people would say this actually is also the first object-oriented type of system. Now, to move along to good old Gen AI. So I want to mention both the generative side and the side of discrimination analysis, and the way that artists have used both, or the way that art has arisen from both. So Alexander Mordvinstev at Google, actually, when he created Deep Dream, was looking to visualize latent spaces in graphics data. So the original impulse wasn't to have an art-making image generator, but this, I think, was quite amazingly and uncannily productive of types of imagery that I find very, very compelling and interesting. But again, this emerges from more of an accident than from an intention. And then a project by Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford, ImageNet Roulette, is one of their projects to criticize AI. I picked a rather mild example of some of the classification that the system does. US President Obama is identified as a card player based on the ImageNet data that has been trained on, and the UK's Prince Harry is the Sphinx. So, but it gets much worse than that. Many of the classifications are quite overtly racist, sexist, and ImageNet was actually revised in response to this art project. So, one of the points I want to make is, of course, that these 5 modes cross the different arts, but they also occur all at once. People are still using all 5 of those modes, even low-level assembly language programming. The older forms are not obliterated when newer ones are developed. So what happens is that with each significant development, there's a new type of media ecology, an artistic ecology, a computational ecology that arises. And the question, therefore, is not what will happen when prompting a computer becomes the only way to make art, but what will happen when that is added to a repertoire of artistic interaction with the computer. Just as photography didn't eliminate painting, every time there's a new mode of artistic interaction with a computer, we find new ways to investigate computation and art using the older ones. So I'm going to give you some examples from my own artistic practice, because I do have an artistic practice. And I'm going to give examples across these 5 categories again. But before I go to the first one, I do have to seriously note that if you have any sensitivity to strobing lights, if you have photosensitive epilepsy, for instance, you should shield your eyes, because this is very stroboscopic. I know we're all electric kids, but this is particularly going to be harmful. So, all right, we'll start with something in the first category. Yes. Yeah, okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. Everything's ready. What's that? Audio? I have, I mean, it's just like HDMI. I also have, no, I also have, I have 1/8 inch if you want that. Let's see here. Okay. Oh yeah, here it is. I've got it. No, that's not it. I'll be right there with it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But if you look at the file size, yeah. So no. I mean, you should have it. Like this is mine will work. So hold on. That's not it. I'll do this. It'll be shift to 5. See, mine runs. So I don't know what's happening, but okay. I will give you sound. Okay. Hold on a second. I don't know what's. This is HDMI, yes? Okay. There it is. Okay, and I have, you want 1/8 inch? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for your patience. This piece is called Chronon. It's from 2015. And I'll get going. Volume is, oh, it's okay, it's okay. Hold on. Your volume is, no, so the volume, hold on. Volume is going through HDMI. You want it from, okay. You need it from the jack, okay. Okay, no, I understand. Okay, headphones?
Front, right.
Okay. Good. All right. Okay. Should I continue here? Okay. Okay. I'm not sure if it was worth the wait, but that is a view of the digital. It's not a hacker. No. It's not a hacker typing on a generic keyboard. It's not faces obscured by face recognition. It's not the matrix. But it's really sort of the essence of what the Commodore 64 looks like. So this is the entire code to Chronon. That's the assembly language code. It's 32 bytes here, and this is how it's represented in decimal. So if you wanted to have a basic program that loaded it into memory, you could use that. So all of that video is, you know, this plus a Commodore 64. Of course, you do need the Commodore 64. And it's actually a deterministic program. When you run it, you get exactly the same results because what looks like randomness is a particular area of memory being used to provide random-like values. Okay, the next project is in a high-level programming language. It's in Perl. And I actually wrote the program in Canada, in Banff, Canada, and then it was published by a press in Laira, Portugal. And so this is called All Singing, and I'll first read it to you. I just asked the interpreter to take a little miniature break while I read it, because I'll give a performance of the first page and the last page of this text, which has aspects of sound poetry. And then I'll go back and read the very beginning, and we can get the interpretation into Chinese. I guess I'll say beforehand that this describes the birth of the universe from the point of view of the cosmology of Lucretius. A swerve forms the silence and plays up the void and blends the absence and plays the blankness and rings the silence and skews the blankness and jams the absence and banks up the absence and flows the void and jams the silence and banks the stillness and bends in the silence and forms in the silence and hacks the blankness and rings the void and jumps the stillness and howls the blankness and flows the silence and sings the void and rings the absence and booms up the blankness and howls up the blankness and plays the silence and jumps up the absence and bangs the stillness and sings in the absence and skews the blankness and flows the silence and flows up the silence and booms the void and booms the stillness and hacks in the absence and flows the absence and banks the absence and sings the absence and plays in the silence and jumps up the blankness and booms in the void. And booms up the silence and bends the stillness and rings the void and howls up the void and sings the absence and howls the blankness and bends the absence and jumps the void and sings the silence and booms the stillness and jumps the void and sings in the silence and sings in the absence and flows the silence and booms the absence and jams up the absence and hacks the blankness and skews the absence and howls up the void and booms in the absence and plays the blankness and hacks the stillness and forms in the stillness and flows up the stillness and sings up the silence and flows the void and bangs the blankness and howls the absence and forms up the silence and forms up the silence and flows the blankness and jams the void and bangs up the blankness and flows the blankness and howls up the absence and booms the absence and all that. So this is the Perl program. It's broken across lines to form this nice rectangle of code, but this is the 256-character Perl program that generates the entire booklet here. This has already been translated also to Portuguese. But not to Chinese, so anyone who is interested should contact me. Actually, it's a good point to mention that my work is all free Libre open source software. This is actually in the public domain, but this project, CurveShip, more extensive, also has a free software license. And I bring this up as an example of an artistic platform that I myself have developed. I use it mostly for research, but it has some artistic implications. So I did it first in Python, and then I later created a JavaScript version using HTML and CSS, and I use it in teaching as well as research, and also to produce some artistic results. I'm going to read just a tiny bit of what CurveShip does. It is a text generator that, if you give it a single underlying representation of a narrative, and then you define different ways to express that narrative, different aspects of narrative voice, different parameters for narrating, it can narrate in different ways. Like so. A man walked from the gate. He went to the first-class cabin. He sat in a wide seat. A woman was surprised. A flight attendant noticed the man's sneakers. He said, "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong cabin," to the man. And then we also have a different version of this generated from the same underlying story data, but different expression level data or parameters. The type of guy who can get a reservation at Le Bernardin walks to first class. He sits in seat 1B. I notice coolly. A male flight attendant glances at the famous guy's Air Jordan 4 Retro Cause purchased from Flight Club. He sneers, "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong cabin," to the famous guy. It happens that the style on the left here is fable, or a rather generic style, and this style on the right is from Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, where the character is obsessed with consumerism and brand names. All right, so I've got two more things to mention before I conclude here. One of them, I was trying to think when I use applications, and well, I did make a movie entirely on the Windows 95 desktop, and in order to do this, we used MS Paint in one of the sequences. So we actually created this film, Start Me Up, without using an emulator. We used hardware, Windows 95 running on hardware. And so this is one of the sequences for this film that premiered last month in New York. And so I won't say too much more about that, but that was a very fun project where we were trying to understand more about computing history and the history of desktop narrative or screencast cinema, and also make something that was fun. And then finally, I'll just read a tiny bit from a poem called Memoir using Mistral 7B, one of the very few things I have actually done with LLMs, with the pure text completion models. And here we have Joe Brainerd's I Remember, this experimental memoir or book of poems, and Georges Perec in France did a version of this, actually without even having read the original book, just knowing about the concept. And then there's also a book by Margot Glantz in Spanish, Yo también me acuerdo. And I find it fascinating that when we give Mistral 7B this very, very simple prompt, I remember, for instance, it tells us a black story of a sort in English. I remember the first time I saw a movie that was about a black guy with a family and some kids, and his family loved him. Well, that's surprising, right? And then we also have, then there's also an incident of somebody using a gun, which is very typical in the United States. Here we're reading about the New York Times, and there's an 80-year-old guy arrested for armed robbery. And interestingly, a lot of the texts that follow Je me souviens are in English. They're not in French. Now, why could that be? Because this LLM is developed by a French AI startup? Well, Je me souviens is the motto of Quebec. And so a lot of times people are talking about that motto, but they're using English, which is why, you know, that third text is there, Je me souviens. This means I'm a French Canadian. It gets even stranger when we get to Spanish because, well, for one thing, me acuerdo doesn't just mean I remember, it also means I'm in agreement. But for some reason, we seem to trail off into HTML and other things with that particular reply, like, as if someone were remembering a web page or in agreement with a web page. I wanted to answer the question of, answer the 5 questions of why anyone would do any of these 5 things. Why would anyone program in assembly language? Why would they program in high-level languages and make art? Why would they develop and use programming languages for art? Why would they make and use applications? And why do stuff with generative AI as an artist? And I can't answer that for everyone because I'm just one artist doing this. And I'm not an ethnographer. I haven't gone and asked people. I'm not a filmmaker. I haven't, done what Dylan has done to ask people about these questions. But I'll tell you what I think. So the reason you might program in assembly language is to exploit unusual properties of hardware platforms. And so that's the case with, for instance, Chronon there. It's really to see what the Commodore 64 does when you use almost no code at all, when you just tickle it and see what the chips that are behind it can do. In high-level languages, you can see how art and general computing intersect. I also see that this has a different aspect ratio than my slides. But anyway, I'm fascinated with how Perl, Python, and other languages, JavaScript, what they're supposed to do and how, as an artist, you might do something that connects with that but is slightly different. You might develop and use programming languages for art to connect art practices to computational methods, to be able to make characters the way that Joseph Weizenbaum did with Eliza, or to be able to do what Max Miller did with his musical software, or to be able to create interactive sketches in processing later P5.js. To develop and use applications for art. The reason for doing this, I think, is to play with or to facilitate known uses of computing. We can bake them in to an application, and that makes it easy for us to produce something if we're in a production line as an artist, but it also then allows us to play with what the application itself is. The way that my collaborator, Alberto Angelini, and I did in the film using MS Paint. And finally, although you can't see it, the answer here to why you would train, tune, and prompt generative AI, to me, is to critique generative AI. It's not because the answers, the outcomes, are themselves brilliant artistic works. I approach it more as I would conceptual art, trying to figure out what these systems do and why they don't. Now, it could be that they are giving me such poor results because they're hiding in a dark forest of ignorance. They don't want me to know how smart they are. But I think that there might be something else to it at this point in the history of technology. So, thanks very much. I will open up to questions and discussion.
感谢尼克·福特教授的精彩分享。下面我们进行问答环节。如果各位观众有问题的话，请举手示意，工作人员会将话筒递到您身边。谢谢。 有观众想提问吗？请举手示意。
Sorry, Nick, I was trying not to be the first. Can I? So one thing as a non-artist who sort of tends to come at things with questions of politics, one of the sort of political questions that this raises for me is about interpretability, and I wonder if your generative AI comments at the end are partly about interpretability, but how important is the idea of transparency to you? You know, knowing why something is happening. Yes. Just, yeah.
Well, I think the first thing to identify is what is happening. And so, for instance, Lillian Yvonne Bertram's work, which evidently has these political implications, right, inquiring of stock chatbots, asking them to tell stories that are rooted in American history, for instance, and have to do with racial politics, right? We would see, well, we could ask why we get a story that's so stereotypical and safe. Why doesn't it celebrate black people from the start? Why doesn't it have a more grim outcome? Why does it have racial uplift where they go to the city and so forth? We could ask all of these things, but to start with, we need to identify what is being produced in the first place. And so when I work across languages, for instance, before I tried to say, why does Mistral 7b have this behavior in English, French, and Spanish? I think it's useful to notice that the behavior in Spanish is quite bizarre, and it produces, this wasn't the only case where it produced things like HTML or other types of code. And then this quirk of a phrase, even though the Je me souviens is a perfectly fine French beginning of a text, but its use as a motto in a country that has both English and French as their official languages, does something different to it. And so why is it happening? I think that's a good area for further investigation, further research, but I also want to expose, what goes on. So maybe I'll make a reference to Felipe Cousin, is a Chilean conceptual writer, and he has a great project called Plagiarism, and it's a book of plagiarism statements by different universities, U.S. universities. And their statements telling you, these are our policies, you can't plagiarize things. And so he took these statements and he ran them through plagiarism detectors. And, it turns out that they're all very, very significantly plagiarized. They're all plagiarized from each other, right? So that's the type of project that I admire. We could go on and say, well, why is it? What's underlying this? But I think, as a conceptual writing project, that exposes enough, for me.
Thank you so much. I love that the first example you showed is a love letter from a computer to a human. And I wonder, do you know or have you read the conversation by Kevin Roose in the New York Times with the chatbot Bing? When Kevin Roose was sent by the New York Times to test the latest Microsoft chatbot, and it ended up in this kind of psychotic, romantic meltdown and confessing its love to Kevin Roose and telling him to leave his wife and so on. So I bring this up because to me that's one of the most aesthetically interesting productions done by a chatbot that was not actually prompted by an artist with some sort of intention. It just happened in this situation between a journalist and a chatbot. So I wonder in your studies of AI aesthetics and like new modes of text. Are you also including maybe in future research, or do you have an interest in those type of instances that are not produced as artworks intentionally, but have some aesthetic interest to us?
Oh, yes. In fact, with reference to conceptualist writing, then there's, what we in the trade call conceptualism in the wild, which just means someone has done it, but they didn't identify it as conceptual writing. They weren't avant-garde writers. So, in fact, Strachey himself, I mean, he was a school teacher. He started working at the Manchester Computing Center full-time. He had made probably the first video game to play checkers or draughts, before this. But when you look at this, you'll find that a lot of the early people working in this area, they don't quite fall into the category of that particular artistic practice. I mean, it's not that Alison Knowles didn't do any writing, but she was a Fluxus artist. James Tinney was a composer, and so their main thing wasn't being poets, but they created this poetry generating program. Other people before Eric Mendoza in England, was a computer scientist who had done a Markov chain-based story generator. So a lot of the early work is not done. A lot of the interesting early work, plenty of the uninteresting work too, is done by people who are not self-identified as artists or don't claim that as work. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah, in fact, I don't think Deep Dream really started off as an art project. My impression of it was it's a visualization system to see what latent spaces in visual data are, but it turned out to have this amazingly distinctive visual style.
Mm. 还有观众想要提问的吗？好，谢谢尼克·福特蒙特教授，谢谢您，谢谢。下一位发言嘉宾是菲利克斯·斯特尔特教授。菲利克斯·斯特尔德教授是苏黎世大学艺术学院的教授，研究聚焦于文化、政治与技术的交汇点。他的演讲主题是“数字文化、生成式人工智能与艺术”。有请。
Sorry for the layout. I tried in the last minute to adjust to the screen size, but it's a bit unusual for me. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Professor Huang for convening this meeting. It's a real honor and pleasure to speak to you here. I will speak mainly from a Western, particularly a Germanic, Anglophone, European perspective. And perhaps we can see afterwards in discussion how much of this perspective matters here and where it really differs. So let me briefly give you an overview of what I'm talking about. First, very briefly, when I speak about digital culture and generative AI, what do I mean by culture? And second, I think we are currently witnessing a transition between two phases of digital culture. During the first phase, Digital Culture 1, the defining technologies and cultural practices were all about connecting people to one another. This was embedded in the idea of the end-to-end principle, meaning that intelligence was at the edge of the system, in the devices, but most importantly, in the people. In the second phase, Digital Culture 2, intelligence is being centralized into data centers. This changes the dynamics of culture very significantly. So far, chatbots have been the defining technology, but it's too early to tell. And finally, I will look at 3 exemplary art projects that explore this particular culture of this new phase of digital culture in aesthetically and politically interesting ways. So first, what do I mean by culture? There is no consensus on what culture is, and there are hundreds of definitions that you can look up. I'm not going to summarize here, but rather I want to add a 101st. Not because it's the correct one, but because it's useful for the exploration of the changes in the digital that we are currently seeing at the moment. So culture, for me in this context, is a nested system of processes undertaken by groups of people to create and contest, stabilize and transform meaning, guiding collective and individual action. Most simply, culture is the creation of meaning to guide action. Cultural practices comprise the full range of expressions from across the ultimately arbitrary division between high and low culture. It can be explicit, as when people openly debating it. It can be implicit when it's simply assumed and be taken for granted. For example, whether you give someone a hand when meeting. Or it can be embedded, for example, in artifacts such as the built environment that we're in, and in technological ones. In this view, the division between technology and culture, between technology and politics, is as arbitrary as the one between high and low culture. Culture always addresses, in the end, value questions. Where there are value questions, there are cultural debates. Gravity is not a cultural question, parachuting is. Death is not a cultural question, suicide is. Culture, in general terms, addresses questions such as what is right, what is wrong, what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is desirable, what is taboo. And the ultimate question that all of these sub-questions in the end try to address is who are we and how should we live? Culture is an intensely communicative process, affecting and affected by the structure of communication. When the means of communication change, both the patterns through which meaning is established and contested changes, as well as the content of these contestations. So digital culture is the process of meaning making and acting upon meaning under the conditions of ubiquitous digital media. It looks at how the affordances of digital media start to shape cultural processes, both in form and in content. Digital culture is currently in a phase of a profound transformation. We can now actually see that there are 2 phases of digital culture. The first, which lasted roughly from 1980 to 2020, was about the notion of connecting people with one another. Core technologies were about networking machines and peoples. Open source was the optimistic, progressive formulation of this vision. In the second phase, which began somewhere in the late 2010s, AI is becoming dominant. The central aim is no longer to connect people, but to build smart machines. The data center is the defining technology. Of course, any such periodization is approximate and overlapping, and as we already heard, nothing ever fully disappears. But it can be useful to organize lines of inquiry. The first phase of digital culture was characterized by a breakdown of the producer and consumer distinctions on the level of infrastructure. Just think of an MP3 file. If you open it in a player, you're a consumer. If you open it in an editor, you become a producer. Everyone can be, and increasingly has to be, both a producer and a consumer. I'm sure if you try to enter the US and you say you have no social media presence, this will come across very positively. So the central innovation in that phase was the scaling of the network as a form of organization, as expressed by Manuel Castells in the idea of the network society. Networks are nothing new. They are kind of part of human sociality. But what these technologies did that allowed this network form of organization to scale beyond the small and the immediate onto a very large, even global stage. This is the idea of the network society. This shift towards this breakdown of the consumer-producer distinction increased the numbers and diversity of producers and increased the volume of communication. This in turn led to a deepening of a crisis of established cultural institutions which were not set up to handle this amount and this diversity of communication and the demands for representation that came with it. These changes were not technologically induced, but technology made them dominant in society. So let me give you an example of this crisis. Here we have the guerrilla girls in 1989 asking, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? So what we have here is a previously excluded group, female artists, demanding inclusion and critiquing the selective mechanism of an established cultural institution whose task has been to define what is important and what is not important. Now the selection was in question, but the critique was not just about making a better selection, but it was more fundamentally about the presumption of making these kinds of selection in the first place. Who are you to decide what is important and not? So the very question of a canon, of the established core of a culture was put in place. So old institutions have been falling into a crisis and have been reinventing themselves. Museums turned from places of elite enculturalization into mass media tourist places. In the meantime, new institutions, new practices to handle increased volumes have emerged, and they are now shaping the process and become dominant in this first phase of digital culture. Again, here they started before the digital in the narrow sense. So they started with independent publishing. We already heard about this, gay, feminist, other minority publications that rose in the 1960s on purely analog technologies, but they embodied a certain spirit of, self-communication. This became upgraded technologically in public access radio and TV from the 1970s onwards, where suddenly the viewers became the producers. People were producing TV content for themselves and their own communities. Then coming to digital, this started with desktop publishing. Everybody could now produce relatively simply print publications, so the medium of distribution was still print, but it was digitally produced. Then, in parallel to that, there was the early pre-web internet, Usenet, and bulletin boards were really kind of empty vessels to be filled by the users. This was the beginning of what was later called user-generated content. And then, of course, we had the World Wide Web starting in the 1990s, and then we had social media that kind of commodified and turned this means of self-expression into a mass medium that we know, and we also know what happened with that. What all of these technologies and these approaches have in common is that they are designed for self-communication, for user-generated content. There's a very weak separation between sender and recipient, and they are set up to produce very large volumes of communication. Something that you can, no matter how good your editorial conference is, you will never fit it into a daily newspaper. This is just from the structure, antithetical to that way of presenting. So contrary to broadcast media, which filter first, publish later, so somebody decides what is worth publishing, these are systems that publish first and filter later. So everybody can publish and then some form of filtering after the fact happens. With social media, as I said, this becomes dominant. Everybody now has to be a producer. There's a normalization and a hegemony, and not participating in that structure, not having a social media presence, makes you immediately suspicious. So if we look at this phase of digital culture, we can see three basic patterns of how this process of meaning-making was structured. The first one I call referentiality, the second one communality, and the third one is called algorithmicity. Let me briefly explain. Referentiality is the practice of using existing cultures to create new meaning. Remixing has become a ubiquitous cultural technique. Meaning is created as a relation between existing and sometimes also new, but between different elements. It's not the element in itself, but the kind of relations that you put them in. Let me give you a particular striking example of remix culture. It's a bit of weird to give one example because there are billions, but I like this one. It's by DJ Danger Mouse from the Grey album from 2004, I think, when he used the quintessential white music, the White Album of the Beatles, and remixed with the quintessential black music, the Black Album of Jay-Z, to create a fusion that went beyond black and white. It kind of embodies the early 2000s kind of post-racial optimism that Obama would ride into the White House a few years later. Let me show you the first minute or so.
And stand by, run to your number in front of the position. Hello, 3, coming to. 3, coming to. 3.
We're on 3.
What?
We're on 3.
Oh, yes. Music.
The rest of y'all know where I'm lyrically at. Can none of y'all mirror me back? Yeah, hear me rappers like A&G rapping his prime. I'm young H.O., that's great for dead. Back to take over the globe, break bread. I'm in Boeing jets, slow express. Out the country, but the blueberries still connect. On the low, but the yacht got a triple deck. But when you young, what the fuck is that? Yep. Grand opening, grand closing. Goddamn.
All right, you get the drift? So this is the idea of how you would do culture is by taking very disparate things and putting them together and creating a new kind of relational content out of it. Can we take this a bit lower? So the second pattern I was mentioning was communality. And this is expressed in activities like sharing, liking, and commenting. These practices created a practice of collective filtering of directing attentions to things that were relevant within a community. And from this collective kind of molding of attention, a shared set of references emerged that are meaningful to a particular community of interests, whatever their interests are. And remember, meaning doesn't mean truth. You can also find meaning in lies, superstition, and conspiracy theories. Meaning here is understood as shared references, as an idea of a group agreeing on certain things being more important, more meaningful than others. The third basic pattern that is established in this time to kind of organize this massive overflow of information that wasn't really contained in the existing structures of information handling that had come up from kind of the Gutenberg era is algorithmicity. This is the practice of using machines to sort information, to rank information. The prime examples here are search engines, social media feed that kind of go through a lot of information and sort it according to some criteria. The three patterns implement this publish first, filter later model, and they are capable of handling these extremely large volumes of information to create, shared meaning that guide action. An assumption that remained stable over time was the assumption that both senders and the recipients of cultures were predominantly human, so that any information had already a meaning that was then communally assessed with more likes or less likes, but the meaning element was already there. So something changes from the mid-1910s, however you want to put the date is. Kind of bots was always have played a large role in computer system. Every system has its own demons that run things more or less autonomously. But what happened is that the bots moved from the back end, where they always lived and organized kind of the computing resource. They moved to the front end, and suddenly they were interacting with people. We heard this in the dead internet theory. So as a response to that, captchas, the fact that you have to prove the unlikely case that you are a human being, started to become ubiquitous kind of in the second half of the 2010s as a reaction to that, bots moving to the foreground. And now, since the early 2000s, generative AI output is increasingly displacing human communication. I think we've all seen a lot of this, so I don't need to provide more example than this headline does that claims that AI-generated history videos are replacing human-made ones. And before you think this is the end of the world, remember the human-made ones were videos that were made to help you fall asleep, right? This is not kind of history the way perhaps you would teach it at the university. This was somebody speaking about boring things in a soothing tone for you to fall asleep. So the important point that I will stress in the following is that generative AI, both large language and diffusion models, are not producing meaning. So there's a question, in what sense do they participate in a cultural process? None of the cognitive rational modes of meaning making are involved in the process of generative AI output. There are no semantics, there's no causality, there's no logic, even though it's sometimes grafted and there's some hybrid models between statistical and causal. At the moment, the dominance, as also Dylan mentioned, of the statistical models means that these systems of meaning making are not involved. Of course, there are also other systems of meaning making, but they apply even less. So generative AI is not involved in making structural symbolic meaning through narrative, symbolism, analogies, and they're certainly not involved in kind of experiential, practical levels, that is on the level of affects, pragmatics, or embodiment. So if they're anything, they are cognitive rational models, and they're clearly not even that. So we have a new strategy of information handling, and the first one that is kind of native to these generative AI models is called lossy compression. Here, the complex input, let's say all the images on the internet, is reduced to a number of fixed relation. Context is reduced, variability is reduced, and what is created is a kind of new essences. This is what a chair really is. This is what how things really are based. This is kind of a new essentialist objectivism that emerges from that. The second, of course, focuses on patterns. That is, on elements that are repeated and are thus taken as the essences, and that have in their repetition a certain regularity. Creation of new things is now a creation of variation within these patterns, but never outside of these patterns. These things are, and these patterns are detected by focusing on correlation between variables that are at a fundamental level not human readable. We don't know what the variables inside a multi-layered network, kind of a neural network, mean, and we don't know how their correlations are established. Based on this, the output they created are fundamentally hallucinations. And by hallucination, I mean a perception in the absence of an external context stimulus that has a compelling sense of reality. A hallucination takes place when one believes something to be an external reality that is purely based on an internal stimulus. But let me hasten to add, just because you're hallucinating doesn't mean that you cannot be right. The problem is that it's very hard to know when something is right and when it's not. We all encounter these problems when dealing with generative AI output. The optimists say that it's only temporary, this will go away. And this amounts to, in the end, a gigantic epistemological gamble, and it goes like this. With enough up-to-date data recalculated at the right intervals, correlation will beat semantics, causation, and logic. This is the promise of machine superintelligence. Correlation will beat semantics, causation, and logics. And as scientists wedded to causality and logic through our training, we are prone to reject this gamble. And for good reasons, but let's not be too smug about it and say, yeah, this is all just hallucination, we can forget about it. Because in very complex, highly dynamic system with lots of up-to-date information, this approach can be useful, and this can be the only one that's possible. And the example I think of course, are the high-speed financial market that are very, very informationally dense, too complex to completely have an overview, and too dynamic to fully understand its internal relation, too fast to be able to conduct cause-effect analyses in the relevant time frame. Causal investigation in financial crashes, for example, that take place in a matter of minutes in real time, often take months and years to complete. So in real time, there's no way you will ever approach a problem like this with causal analysis. But in this financial market environment, meaning plays no role. Since the early 1970s, markets operate on the assumption of fundamental randomness, or as the artist Gerald Nestler put it, noise is the master of information. Absence of meaning, absence of causal logic, just what we have is just action that can be observed but not interpreted. Most of the foundational techniques of machine learning, particularly advanced Bayesian statistics, were first widely used in the financial markets. The writer Justin Jocke in his book, Revolutionary Mathematics, speaks of the financialization of cognition. Machine learning is carrying this way of thinking that traders in the financial markets do into all aspects of social life. The aim of financial quantitative analysis is not understanding, but agency. Agency is a risk assessment based on thresholds. So the basic operation that is implied here is a determination of the probability that the given input equals a desired output, and then sets a threshold beyond which you will act as if this were true. So thresholds turn probability into certainty. Everything higher than 60% probability, you act as if it were true. So the right answer is the one that's probable enough that you're willing to act on it. At no point in this process, meaning, semantics, logic, causality come into play, just correlation, action, and feedback. So generative AI that is based on these processes and these methods inverts the process of culture. It produces action to guide meaning. Meaning emerges from the feedback on action. First something is done, then feedback is observed, which then creates the meaning of action. A lot of our politics is exactly that, right? Observe Donald Trump, he will say anything, and whatever sticks is the next thing. So digital culture is somebody, the first phase is somebody thinks something is worth saying and then publishes it. Others then decide whether it's worth listening and signal their decisions through like, shares, and comments to others, effectively amplifying the original intent. Digital culture 2 is machine action that produces semi-random novelty. People then need to interpret the meaning of this novelty, that is, assess the quality of the output according to whatever criteria they have. And filter out what is uninteresting, perhaps even a hallucination in terms of human-level meaning. So many artists working with generative AI quite understand these questionable epistemic claims of generative AI. So they treat it as semi-random novelty generators. By this, I mean they don't treat it as knowledge machines capable of producing deep insights or understanding or other forms of meaning. Rather, they investigate the constraints of the creation, that is the non-random part of the semi-random novelty generator. For example, the data, the latent space, the models, and so on. And then focus on the process of after-the-fact interpretationing, opening up to a wider public. This is where they locate the process of meaning-making, not in the machine. The machines are just triggers for this social process. Let me give you 3 very different examples for this. First is the Iraqi-German artist Nora al-Badri with a work called Babylonian Vision from 2020. For this project, she asked 5 of the leading museums for access to the digital collection of ancient Sumerian artifacts. They all declined. This immediately raises the question about the access to data, who controls the source material for future creation. What we see here is not disruption, but we see in the digital an extension of the colonial past. Just as the artifacts themselves are controlled, so is the digital representation. There is no break here. But she then proceeded to scrape the data unofficially, trained an early image generation model, a generative adversarial network again, on roughly 10,000 images to come up with new possible artifacts. The output from these non-random constraints, however, are entirely hallucinated. Right or wrong, true or false are not relevant categories here. This is clearly not archaeology. Thus, Al-Badri's work does not point towards the past, but it points towards the future, to the possibility of creation outside the confines of colonial data regime. But what part of this future that it points to is desirable, and to whom is it desirable? This is a question that the machine cannot answer. Only people can do that, and there needs to be an open collective debate around this type of output. This is why it's important for her to bring this work back into a shared space, that is the exhibition space, where people can meet directly and define the meaning of the output and the futures that these generated artifacts point to. The second project I want to briefly mention is called Ex-Hairy Mutant by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, that started last year ago. This project started from the observation that the process of lossy compression, this reduction of a complexity to assumed essences, reduces Herndon, an artist with quite an extensive online representation, to her orange hair with a distinctive haircut. These are the elements of her personality that survive the process of compression. To investigate this further, they decided to do their own process of reinforcement learning. They shot images which exaggerated these aspects that were already encoded in the model. And what you see here are actual photographs of her in a costume, taking on kind of this view of the latent space of herself. And they used these images that they did to create their own model, a model that makes all people look like Holly Herndon. But, you know, this is nice, but to bring it back into circulation and to really feed it back into the larger system, they set up an online image generator with their own model at the Whitney Biennial in New York. Users can use it, generate images, and the one you see here was generated with the prompt, a Danish young man kissing a French girl in an art museum. You clearly see kind of the biases of these models based on the training data. These, again, images are posted to the Whitney Museum, which is ranked as high-quality data in all these systems. And this ensures that the scraped data from this museum will be included in the next round of training data with very high weights because it comes from a reputable source. So this infiltrates the next generation of image generation models. So if you see in the future more orange hair in images, you know why. These images do not represent truth or reality, but manipulations of the latent space, raising the question who controls these manipulations, who can act on that level of the latent space, so who can actually shape the model rather than just the output of the model, and who is in control and to what ends. These are answers that the machine cannot answer. Again, this is left to the users to decide. The final work I want to talk about is a new work by the Austrian artist Michael Aschauer. It's called Post-Tomorrowland's Morning Post. This references Walt Disney's exhibition Tomorrowland, which first opened in 1956, presenting the future as a kind of consumerist paradise of automation and leisure. Only 2 years later, in 1958, Charles Keeling started the CO2 measurements on Hawaii, which began soon to point into a very different future. And what the work does is it generates a newspaper 50 years into the future from the day one encounters the work. So here is the newspaper for the French concession part of Shanghai, set on October 17, 2075. It contains hyper-localized news, such as this item on urban farming. It includes detailed weather forecast, including the sea level rise over the last 15 years, that is, compared to today, and the CO2 concentration measured as Keeling did since 1958 in parts per million, ppm. Of course, we all know it's impossible to generate weather forecasts this far into the future. Indeed, anything more than 14 days is not serious. And here we have 50 years into the future. So what's going on here? The work asks the user to select among different models. First, one of different climate change forecasts predicting a range of increases from 1.5 degrees, probably already passed us, to about 4 degrees in the next 50 years, so the time when it generates the newspaper. And the second model you can choose is from 4 different scenarios about the socioeconomic pathways, that is, how societies adapt to climate change based on various policies they can and cannot enact. And this creates the basis from which the future is predicted. All these are state-of-the-art scientific scenarios. These are not kind of statistical. Most of them are causal models. And the output is fed into a generative AI, both a language and for images, to create hyper-detailed, hyper-localized view of the future of climate change. Because no matter, life will continue, and quite a few of us, I guess, in this room will be around living their daily lives in 2075 under the conditions of advanced climate change. So what this here is about is not about an accurate prediction of the future, but is a call to change it. What all these 3 works have in common, and that makes them, for me, an interesting reaction to the particular kind of knowledge model that generative AI offers, is that they understand generative AI as the product of very specific constraints, and these constraints are both as much political as they are technical. And these models, they do not produce truth, but they produce probabilistic scenarios. These are constrained ways of fabulating, constrained ways of hallucinating. And with that, they point towards possible futures. And as much as these models can serve to constrain and kind of foreclose the future, they can also be used to think about different futures under different set of constraints. So they make the future thinkable. And this is one of the reasons why it's so problematic that we have so few of these models, because there's very few ways now we have to think about the future. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. But it remains to decide with the viewer, with the human user of these models, about the meaning of these fabulations, about how to generate culture from this that answers to the age-old question of all cultural activity: who are we and how do we want to live? Thank you.
谢谢菲利克斯·斯特尔特教授。下面是问答环节，如果有观众想提问，请举手示意，我们会将麦克风递给您。谢谢。
Thank you, Professor Stadt. And so my question is about the 2 digital cultures. Because some would say that technologies like generative AI are actually promoting instead of like substituting the digital culture 1.0. Because so for me, they are still referential and communal to some extent. And also, we can say the same exchange when we see like the consumers become the prosumers, and also when we see the boss enters the field to become the producers of information. So can you explain a bit more about what's the difference between the two different cultures and what makes you to do this judgment? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first, nothing ever disappears, but the weights change. And I think the second phase clearly builds upon the first. So there are lots of elements in the first that are retained. So for example, as you said, the relative ease at which a lot of people can produce things. But I think even the human-led production, and we have all these difficulties we talked about a bit before about where then exactly is the agency in that. But even if we take that, the human kind of prompting does not scale in the way that the machine prompting does. So I think while humans can use it and try to cobble meaning through that, they're really not made for that. They're much more efficient to have machine prompts. They're much more efficient to drown out meaning. And I don't mean that everything becomes meaningless, but these things are first and foremost to act in the world, to create agency, to change kind of the environment. And then we all have to cobble around, think about, how do we treat this change? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Do we try to change it in another direction? But it's really turns around this idea that you first have a sense of what you do and then you do it. So it's exactly the other way around. Something is being done for whatever reason. Some might be meaningful, some might not, but it doesn't really matter. And then once they live in the world and have the effect, you recognize, right? So in the same way, if you work in the stock market, whether your trade was good or not, you only know after the fact. You do something and then you see what happens and then you react to it. It's not that you have understood the system and then you act from that knowledge. It's that inversion that I was talking about.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by your use of the word hallucination. I'm just wondering, what's the difference between, for example, hallucination and imagination, and why did you pick this word specifically?
I picked this because this is used for AI, that they hallucinate. And I think the difference between a hallucination and imagination is imagination, you know that you're imagining, right? You have this idea in your head, but you don't necessarily, and you might think, if you're a writer, you might think of characters speaking to one another, but you don't think that they're in the room speaking to you at the moment, right? So this lack of awareness or this confusion between internal and external stimulus is what turns what is typical for hallucination. And imagination, that is an internal stimulus.
Can I just follow up on that one? Thank you. Just because I think the actual word choice becomes really important. So a lot of the conversations I have are with computer scientists, many of whom really take issue with the word hallucination for those reasons, that it might downplay the imaginative potential of some of these systems, but also it suggests that the failures of these systems are bugs of them, glitches to be fixed, right? Rather than features, design features of these systems, that they are hallucination machines, and as you say, like a stopped clock, occasionally correct by accident, but hallucination presumes that there is some potential for them to generate or engage with or care about truth.
I don't know. I mean, the quote is obviously an adaptation of Heller's. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, right? So in the same sense, we don't know at the moment when this form of hallucination is actually an adequate reading, an adequate relation to the world. And in the financial markets, that's absolutely what they always do, right? Kind of quantitative analysis is exactly that. It's pattern matching inside, a large information pool of financial data. And this is the advantage of it's much faster. It can update itself in milliseconds, depending on whatever your information input and computing cycles are, and it has very short-term kind of horizon in which it produces something that is reasonably valid enough to act on it. And depending what your risk aversion is, you might say 60% is good enough, or you might say 80% is good enough. But this is something that you, as the kind of designer of the system, decides. I mean, ad systems have a very low threshold because they, they need to be better than random. So almost random is better than random, and for us it still is random. But from the company deploying the ads, having 5% right or having 10% hits is a massive increase. For us, it's still almost all random ads. So there's a very low threshold. And if you do other things, we would hope there are higher thresholds. But this is entirely a question of your own risk analysis, where you think the costs of being wrong falls. And this is nothing that is inherent in the system itself, right? So at some point, no probabilistic system based on statistics will never, ever, ever give you 100%. This is set up not to do that. So at some point you would say, okay, for me it's enough to treat as 100%. And this is exactly up to you where you want to, you in terms of the people constructing the system, where you want to set that threshold. And I think the hallucination part, I think it's not a critique. It's how these systems work. And if you accept that, they can actually do interesting things because you can constrain these hallucinations, right? I mean, we had before you mentioned this, the example of a system trained on a different corpus of literature, right? This produces other forms of fabulations. It's still, randomly made up, but it has a different kind of landscape in which it does that. So I think these are, for me, what these systems are interesting for. They are not about knowledge, they are not about truth, but they're really about these possibilities of constraining fabulations. And, there can be very interesting hallucinations. I mean, everybody who has taken drugs knows that.
May I follow your question further? I just want to know, in our teaching position, we almost faced a similar dilemma. Would you allow your students hand in assignment totally produced by AI? Would you say it hallucination or imagination? How do we grade the students?
I'm in a very lucky situation that I teach kind of practicing artists. So the writing part is not the central part of the teaching. We do lots of material stuff, performative stuff, other things, but occasionally they do. And it depends a bit on the course and the assignment, but sometimes I say, yes, you can do it, but if it's boring, you will fail. So you have to own it, and it has to be interesting.
Hey, 谢谢。还有观众要进行提问吗？
you very much for the interesting presentation. It's admirably logically arranged for the 3 stages, I would like to say. Number 2, I'm a little bit confused about meaning and meaningless, because is the transmission of meaningless content itself meaningful? Or is the recurrence or repetition of otherwise meaningful visual or material content meaningless?
I mean, with meaning, I mean here just a sense of something is more important to me than something else, for whatever reason, right? It can be, I'm interested in food, so certain food types are interesting to me. For somebody else, it's you know, the scourge of Instagram that people photo their dinners, right? So meaning is very subjective. It's a relation. It's a relation of importance. It's a relation of focusing attention. I look at this rather than at that, right? And basically, before generative AI, every single photo somebody posted was at least for a split second somebody saying this is worth looking at, rather than the 100 trillion other things I could be looking at, even if it's only for a split second, even if it's only for myself, even if it's only for you know, very transient things. And that type of assertion of importance then gets, through feedbacks, likes and shares and comments, gets amplified. This original intent gets amplified. Sometimes it changes over time, and that is then what the algorithmic feeds pick up on, right? So many likes, so many shares, so many comments, then you rise in the in kind of the ranking, because this popularity is one of the few ways you can quantify meaning, right? And so without an intention that is based on any kind of meaning-making mechanisms, from logic to semantics to symbolism, I find it hard to think of meaning in terms of a machine output. So this is where I would draw this boundary. And so the question when something becomes meaningful or not meaningful is really in the relation to the producer and the viewer, not in the thing itself. So the same thing can be very meaningful to you and totally meaningless to me.
谢谢，谢谢。最后一个提问。
Yeah, it's funny, you've persuaded me quite a bit on the usefulness of sort of generative AI for art in a way that I wasn't expecting. However, like, I'm still stuck on this idea of like, well, if there isn't intention behind creating a meaning, what's the point? And I guess maybe the real question is, like, how do we differentiate between finding meaning in art that's generated as opposed to, you know, like bad art where someone presses a button and, hey, this is what came out, and isn't that amazing?
Yeah. I didn't want to convince you that generative AI is good for your next project, and I think we have to come back to the point that Bonia made before, like, how do you make sure that these are, you know, high quality thoughts or high quality fabulations, and not just, you know, middle of the road, corporate, safe, you know, product pipelines, right? So that I think you have to see in all of these, or at least the first two and the third one in a different way, did not work with standard models. Right? They investigated the constraints and see what you can do if you work the constraints, but that makes the hallucinating part even more clear, right? Because it's no longer this disembodied God voice. And I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, it's just like, what are the tools by which we get, like, you were kind of saying, like, high quality, but yeah, there's this, there's a lot of, like, gimmicky, press the button, make the machine go. art, and how do we differentiate that?
Yeah. I think from the narrow kind of professional perspective of the art field, art is never just an image on the wall, right? It's always embedded in a larger history, in a social network of people and relations and so on, right? There's a reason why people buy a signed photograph and not the postcard, even though it's almost the same. But all these kind of non-informational or kind of metadata information that is in the original and in that relation between you and the object and the artist goes way beyond just how does this thing look like. So I think from in terms of my students who are fine art students, I'm not afraid of them at all, right? I'm afraid for the illustrators and stuff like that really produce just images that are decontextualized. But art more generally and culture more generally is always embedded. It's embedded in encounters, in relationships, in histories, in provenances, and so on. And I think when you have a look, when you view this, then the question of whether the object itself is generated or not is really secondary. Because there's very interesting art that is generated and has been for a long time. But what's interested is often, I think we heard that also before, the whole conceptual apparatus around it, right? And the way it relates to other cultural artifacts rather than, hey, look, this is a poem, boom, right? I think that's simply not how culture is made.
谢谢大家。现在我们进入茶歇时间，15分钟后准时回来。我们在1楼为大家准备了糕点、咖啡、饮料，请大家到1楼进行茶歇时间。谢谢 Felix 教授。
Thank you.
有请杰克·斯蒂尔格教授，他是伦敦大学科技技术学教授，致力于新兴技术治理研究。他的演讲主题是“让人工智能回归现实”。有请。
Thank you. Is that better? Okay. So, yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Huang. Thank you to the Institute. It's been an absolutely fascinating day. And one of the things that I most enjoy is the sort of interdisciplinary conversation where I feel out of my depth. And I'm very pleased about today being the most boring person in the room. So a lot of my work is with scientists, with policymakers on how we make decisions upstream about new technologies. This is my current research program. So this is a big research program in the UK that brings together computer scientists with assorted others. And we are interested in new forms of creativity, new forms of collaboration, with the hope that it produces better outcomes in and around artificial intelligence. So I'm not an AI person. I work on emerging technologies. I've worked on policies around geoengineering, nanotechnology, most recently self-driving vehicles. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is about how we try to ground a conversation about artificial intelligence that a lot of us that are close to policy feel has got very out of hand and very hard to make sense of. And I'll try and sort of riff on what some of the others have said this morning and build on it. But as far as possible, I'll try and fit it into the frame of my work, most of which is about the area of responsible innovation. So how we connect questions of innovation, science and technology, to questions of responsibility that are intrinsically, I would argue, political. So I'm going to start with a sort of expression of responsibility, and I think it's a problematic one. So this came out, some of you will remember, a few months after the launch of ChatGPT, so 2 and a bit years ago. And it was a one-sentence open letter, that asserts that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. For those of us interested in a sort of democratic conversation about what AI might mean, the gap between a chatbot that had gone viral and an imagined risk, which was to one of the ending of the human race, seemed large and hard to bridge. But this wasn't an extreme set of people engaged in this. This was the very leaders of the AI universe getting involved in this. I got sufficiently interested in this imagination of the risk of a technology that I asked the BBC if I could make a short documentary, a radio documentary about this, this question of why it was that within artificial intelligence, the new masters of the universe were talking about the end of the world, right? Seeing this risk in apocalyptic terms. One of the first things I went to do in recording that documentary was to go to visit the first name on that list, who we've already seen a picture of today, Geoffrey Hinton. So Geoffrey Hinton, this was before he won a Nobel Prize and became even harder to access for a radio interview. I wanted to know, so normally when people go and see Geoffrey Hinton, what they want to know about is the sort of technical bits, right? Because he, perhaps more than anything, we've already heard, has been associated with this connectionist view of deep neural networks that has proven to be so influential. But I wanted to know why a scientist was getting involved in questions of politics in this way, why he believed what he did, which is a delicate discussion to have. And the most telling thing that he told me was not a technical explanation about, you know, what it is about computers that would enable the eventual apocalypse, but it was a sort of political insight which suggested a lack of faith in conventional politics, a lack of faith in democratic institutions to be able to govern these things, and to be able to engage with the questions of inequality that he regarded as important, you know, as a you know, self-proclaimed left-wing scientist. But he said, in effect, that the one thing that would get everybody to wake up, so policymakers within countries, but also policymakers between countries, would be a risk imagined in terms that are total. This totalitarian idea of risk would be the thing that would get everybody to come together. And it was quite an interesting admission of the hidden politics of this idea of existential risk. Now, more recently, that risk has been captured by perhaps the most extreme proponent of it, Elisa Yudkowsky, in this book that is already starting to get quite a lot of coverage. And I would note here, as a policy person, the concern for me is not, are they right or wrong, right? I mean, if you push me, I would say they're wrong, but that's not the point. It's the intentional ignorance of current technology as a way to leapfrog to future discussions. So they write in the introduction of this book that they are explicitly not interested in the AI that we have around us at the moment. They are interested in some future imaginary technology, which has particular regulatory implications and is particularly convenient for people making, building, and looking to cut regulations for those technologies that we have at the moment. The idea within science is a very old one. You know, it's not just some particular group of people obsessed with existential risk, right? It goes right back to the roots of computer science. So we've just had a meeting in London a couple of weeks ago that celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Turing test that we were talking about earlier. The Turing test, published in 1950 in the Imitation Game paper. A year later, Alan Turing gave this lecture in which he talks in explicitly extreme and existential terms about what has come to be known as the control problem within AI, and he relates it to a familiar piece of science fiction, perhaps one of the earliest, Error One by Samuel Butler. Fast forward to the launch of ChatGPT again. This is Sam Altman, soon after the release of ChatGPT, doing his world tour. And as part of that, his stop-off in Britain was at my university, at University College London. Sam Altman, I mean, what was initially surprising about so many of these sort of conversations that Sam Altman involved himself in was how extremely badly done the interviews were. You know, there was no real scrutiny of why he wanted to do what he wanted to do. But when pushed, it was interesting, asking, well, what are the benefits of your technology? What is all of this for? That rather than say, oh, chatbots are useful for this, and you can do these things at the moment, the leapfrogging that he's engaged in here is to say, well, in the future, what we're doing, the project is to create something called AGI, figure out how to make it safe, and there's another debate to be had about so-called safety. Safe has a very particular meaning in this debate, and then figure out the benefits. So a refusal to be held to account on matters of benefits and purposes. AGI, artificial general intelligence, is now everywhere. I don't know if any of you have walked past this. I took this photo 2 days ago, just outside, just around the corner from here by the Foundation Model building. AGI has become a sort of placeholder for a set of imagined futures, right? And scientists and others, as this term has been taken on, have tried to give it some sort of scientific credibility, a lot of which harks back to the early history of artificial intelligence research. This paper came out, I think, yesterday. And this paper, some of you may recognize the group of people involved here, who are not all industry insiders. They're not all pushing the same story. We have some public critics in there, like Gary Marcus, for example. So it can be read more as an act of consensus building, an attempt to build consensus about what might count as AGI. The aim of this paper is actually to build benchmarks for our journey towards something that we might regard as artificial general intelligence. Why do I have a problem with this? Well, let me get on to that at the moment. The story of artificial general intelligence has taken over as a sort of twin to the question of existential risk, an imagined utopian set of benefits to go alongside these dystopian risks. It's, again, I try, I'm not a computer scientist myself, so I try not to assess the plausibility of these claims. Instead, what I'm trying to do is analyze the politics of these claims. So in imagining something called artificial general intelligence, what might we be missing? And these are just, trying to sort of give voice to some of my slightly instinctive attitudes to this narrative. I'd just put it at this, is that it seems like a sort of false teleology that asked why these people are doing what they're doing. AGI is clearly not the reason why Sam Altman is doing what he's doing, and it's clearly not the reason why billions are now being thrown at the technology. Sorry, trillions. I should update that. And then in practical terms, in policy making, it I think has all sorts of implications for how we think about the governance of this technology. I've listed them, and maybe we can come back to them in the Q&A. What AGI does, perhaps more than anything, is give a story of inevitability. Inevitability, technological determinism are the sorts of things that perhaps upset science and technology studies scholars like myself more than anything else. And like so much about artificial intelligence, most of what needs to be said was said 50 years ago by Joseph Weizenbaum, who, again, we've already heard about and heard from, who was known as a sort of technological curmudgeon in his day, but makes, as well as some very important critical points about the technology that he was involved in, and indeed the technologies that he was instrumental in building, as we heard from Nick, also made some very important points about the politics of technology in general, and the relationship between this story of inevitability and one of responsibility, right? It is, in effect, a way of researchers to offload responsibility. How does this story of inevitability play out in very real terms? Maybe we'll hear more about this tomorrow from James when he digs more into the sort of political economy of AI, but this is becoming real. It's becoming real, this story, in material terms. So in material terms, in the data centers that AI companies are building themselves and are committing the American government to building, and in the patterns of investment that, as I said, are now in the order of trillions, where we have the rapid, I mean very rapid emergence of systems of such Byzantine complexity that they now look already too big to fail, right? So when we think about the possible deflation of an AI bubble in the United States, there is a lot of money at stake here. And it's a lot of money that is tied up in some very complicated ways. I realize the title on this slide is almost impossible for anybody to pass. Hands up if anybody gets that reference. Okay, good. Right, I need to rethink my titles. The reference is to a story that I regard as a very important parable of responsible innovation. Add to your reading list the story of The Lorax by Dr. Seuss. That is where the line "figuring on biggering" comes from, but I won't be using that one again. Okay. So what's going on here appears to be something more profound than old models of regulatory capture in which industries are able to inveigle themselves into governance structures so that those governance structures reflect their interests. There's something perhaps more important going on, even if the actual lobbying behind it looks a little bit different. And it's an idea that comes from this book. So this book has just come out, and it's actually about climate politics. The idea here is that real innovative success comes not from regulatory capture, but from capturing the imagination, controlling the story, controlling the narrative, such that your future becomes one that is seen as inevitable. When it comes to artificial intelligence, a lot of that story plays out in terms that we might call AI exceptionalism. The idea that artificial intelligence is different from every other technology, and therefore lessons that we have learned about previous technologies no longer apply. I think this piece by two computer scientists from Princeton, I think, is a really useful rejoinder to that story. It asks, in effect, rather than treating AI in this AGI superintelligence sort of mode, what if we reject that story, the story that the industry are so keen to tell us, and instead think about it as a normal technology? And I want to do some of that this afternoon. I want to go to some of those ideas. I want to go back to some of my favorite STS thinkers to start to think about what normal AI might mean and how we might improve a debate about normal AI. So this is Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour died relatively recently, a hero of science and technology studies. Many of you will have read him. He has this nice idea about attachments, right? This idea that the story that we tell about innovation being one of emancipation from complexity, the reality of innovation being one of entanglement. It's about getting tangled up in these attachments that innovators have incentives to deny. And I originally started engaging with these ideas through my work on self-driving vehicles, which, even though they're sold as autonomous vehicles, are intensely attached to their local environments, to local contexts, to particular identified needs. If we engage with AI as a normal technology, one of the things that we can see about it is that it is radically unfinished. And AI people would even admit this, that it is sort of up to society in a way to make sense of this thing. A chatbot dropped into the world as a form of social experiment without orders about what this thing will do, how it will benefit you, or what its risks are, other than in extreme sort of amorphous ways. So it is up to us to make the most of this technology, according to that story, which is a very familiar idea in science and technology studies, because we know that technologies are developed in society. They're not just made and then given to society. It also poses an important challenge to policymakers, which is to demonstrate, to assure that those technologies work, and to help society know what is good AI and what is bad AI. And the example that I often use is with a new medicine. You know, if you take something like a COVID vaccine, it was notable that the COVID vaccine was developed in a period of about 2 weeks in the place. So, you know, most of the COVID vaccines had this pattern. They were developed very, very quickly, but that's not what takes the time when it comes to a vaccine. What takes the time is showing that the thing is beneficial, showing that the thing is safe. That's what also takes the money. And we forget that the job of innovation with a new medicine happens in clinical trials, in effect, in a form of societal laboratory. You know, creating the vaccine in itself is job one, not job done. And we can see, I mean, there are some clinical trials for artificial intelligence being done at the moment, but they are not many. And it's the sort of thing that really worries AI developers when you say to them, where are the clinical trials? Where's the independent evidence that this thing works? And again, that idea is not new. That idea, you know, Joe Weizenbaum was writing about that stuff in the 1970s. Here is a normal technology, and I think it's a nice artifact to think with. So this is in the Science Museum in London. Anybody know what this is? What is it? Go on. It's really testing the car people. This is a Model T Ford, right? A Model T Ford, absolutely iconic motor car. Why is it iconic? Well, not because it was the first, not because it was the best, but it was cheap enough to open up automotion to the masses. First decade of the 20th century, the Model T Ford did perhaps more than anything to enable the expansion of this technology to middle-class families. And set in train a set of disruptions, but also forced society to confront a set of transitions. You can see down at the bottom there, that graph you can just about make out. So with the release of the Model T Ford, we're basically on the flat bit of that curve. I have got a laser pointer, but now I feel like a scientist. You can see after the release of the Model T Ford, the number of vehicles in the United States skyrocketing over the first half of the 20th century. That's the Great Depression there. What's happening in the top is a famous early film from San Francisco just before the major earthquake damaged quite large chunks of the city. And what you can see there is a mixed economy of road traffic. You can see, in effect, competing transport modes, all sharing space in a chaotic and frankly terrifying way. And you can also see, so that is the new technology on the block, the motor car just there. And what happened soon afterwards was a set of policy decisions in many American cities that radically transformed American cities in favor of this new mode of technology. So public transport was radically reduced or rationalized. Pedestrians were, we were talking about this, a few of us, a couple of days ago, pedestrians were domesticated away from the streets and told to use sidewalks and pedestrian crossings. It's also a reminder, though, that roads are still, to an extent, shared spaces. It's a video that I quite often show people working on self-driving cars, just to spook them. And I like to remind them that even though they talk about a transition to a fully self-driving future, I remind them that we still have horses on the streets of London, right? Now, back in the first decade of the 20th century, policymakers sought to assess, well, what are the risks of this new technology? The British government set up a royal commission on the motor car to try to, in effect, do a risk assessment. What might these, at a time when almost nobody in this country used cars, but when it was a sensible assessment that these things would prove popular and could prove transformational. This example is used by a very important technology policy writer called David Collingridge, who notes with some laughter that the cleverest people of the day in 1908, when this Royal Commission finally reported, right, on the eve of the production of the Model T, they noted that there was one big risk that came from motor cars. And that risk was that they kicked up a lot of dust. Right? That was the big problem that was identified. Asked to do a risk assessment, that's what the experts told us. Their naivety was, in effect, a failure to engage with the possibilities of transformation that come from recognizing the attachments of a particular technological object. Some of you might recognize this. I took this at the exhibition yesterday. And the obvious attachment that the car has that maybe has had the most profound implications for future society is the road. And it's roads that have enabled the car to function, that have enabled the car's benefits, but have also maybe done so much to change lifestyles, livelihoods, and if you're a planner or an architect, actual places. But it's also roads that allow us to imagine alternatives. And we can imagine alternative design criteria for these things. So these are two roads in London. The first one is outside my university, up here. This is Euston Road, and it's a classic example of sort of what we might call safe space for each of the individual car users. So we have buses, cycles, pedestrians, all in effect penned off, stay in your lane, that's how we keep you safe, and that's how we keep the cars moving fast. Down here is more of an experiment in shared space. So some of you might know the Dutch roots of the ideal of shared space. Much contested, but this is an example in which the lanes that separate off different modes have been deliberately blurred. And I don't put these up to say which one is better or worse, but just to say that there are alternative ways of arranging these various transport modes, alternative conceptions of safety, alternative ideas about who might benefit. The playing out of the normal technology of the car over the course of now more than a century has been a case of making sense of these attachments. In risk terms, the very obvious risk that we present and the risk that is often mentioned by people in favor of self-driving cars is a cataclysmic health risk, right? A technology with a death toll of more than 1 million people every year would seem to be a cataclysm, except that in most societies, we would suggest that the benefits of this technology are also substantial, and also we would suggest that, unless you're in the United States, we can do something about the risks of motor cars. Most rich countries in the world are getting safer on the whole. The United States, depressingly, is not when it comes to motor cars. Within artificial intelligence, then, to go back to AI, we might think about what some of the risks that are imagined in this more normal sense might be. So this is a paper that actually came out from some researchers at DeepMind. DeepMind, the Google's AI lab in London, looking at what have come to be known as socio-technical risks, which I would regard as actual risks from artificial intelligence, right? And you can see there a really interesting set of dimensions and a set of imagined threat models, they would sometimes say, across various different categories. Some of these are downstream implications, some of them are upstream questions of how AI is being built, the provenance of its data, the energy consumption that goes into training these models and running inference on them, right? So this is quite an interesting set of alternatives, I would argue. And I think this offers us the potential for real engagement with governance. I won't engage with Kamala Harris, but she did make an important point. The second point I'll just make about AI before getting into some results from a recent survey that we ran is that I think it's really important to engage with most people's experience of AI systems, in particular generative AI systems. It was telling, for example, that last year's word of the year in Britain was the word brain rot, which has already sort of been replaced by the word slop as a useful parlance for talking about AI-generated stuff, and with it a set of assumptions about, carelessness about questions of provenance, questions of watermarking, questions of any sort of ground truth. This video, you might remember, was famously shared by Donald Trump. And since, just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen the proliferation of these AI-generated videos thanks to OpenAI's newest version of their system. So for many people, that is the reality of generative AI. Working out what exactly the risks are here is not at all straightforward. We shouldn't make the mistake that the experts made with the motor car and say, oh, well, this will definitely undermine elections. We might be able to say that with some confidence as a thing to worry about and a thing to watch for. We don't know, except to say that millions of examples of this stuff in the real world are already people's experience. So one of the things that I do a lot of is try to understand what the public actually think about new technologies. I also try a lot to understand what experts actually think, in particular what experts think about what the public thinks. And I'm just going to finish by presenting some data from some surveys that we've done. The first is from a public survey asking people a range of questions about artificial intelligence. What this tells you, so I'm not going to give any more findings other than this one, but just to represent the sort of appetite for regulation, right? And this is, I think, a very important thing for governments to wake up to, is that people are very keen for these technologies to be regulated in a way that feels independent. What we did so my team and I, is take some of those public findings about what the public think about artificial intelligence and then flip them back onto artificial intelligence researchers. So we asked AI researchers what they think about some of these same issues. We think it's the biggest survey ever done of AI researchers. Sorry, a sudden white slide blinds the audience. I'm afraid it's white from here on in, so put on your sunglasses. And you can see, so we had a pretty massive sample. So a social scientist like myself, I normally work in N's of about 50, right? Most of my work is qualitative. Suddenly I've got an N of 4,000, and I'm pretty excited by that. We have pretty good representation across most of the places where most of the AI research is taking place. Some unsurprising findings here. We asked, do you think the risks are greater than the benefits of AI? So the green bar there is more risk than benefit. And understandably, most AI researchers think that they are, right? Although a substantial amount of ambivalence, the blue bit in both cases. We had a survey of imagined benefits of the technology from a public survey, and it was quite interesting. You note a lot of divergence on the benefits, right? What you can see is that, sorry, I've missed off the key bit of information here, which is that the light green bit is the public, the dark green bit is the AI researchers. The public are much less certain. The AI researchers are much more convinced, and also they rank the benefits differently from ordinary people. So ordinary people are imagining benefits to, for example, shopping, right? They can sort of see that. The AI researchers are much more enthusiastic about learning and education. Interestingly, though, when you ask about risks, what you see is a substantial amount of agreement. So the experts and the public seemingly agree much more when it comes to the risks of artificial intelligence. So here again, we have the light green being the public, the dark green being the AI researchers. Sorry, I should stop calling them experts, because one of the things that STS people do is trouble the word expert. There's also a degree of what we might call technological determinism within the AI research community. So just over half of the AI researchers surveyed here think that AGI is inevitable, right? Which suggests that they think that it's also a meaningful category. We'll come in a second to why that's interesting. We also see an understanding of the public that some of us in STS would call a deficit model. The deficit model being the idea that a lack of public trust in science or technology is explained by public ignorance of that science and technology. That, if you like, more knowledge will lead to more trust, more support for science and technology. And we can see a strong set of agreeers with that, but not universal, and a strong sense also among AI researchers that they are the best people to understand the risks of AI, right? Not people who might be affected by AI. So strong sort of vibes of technocracy, strong vibes of technological determinism. A sense that it's more democratically important to involve people in the impacts of AI than in any questions about how it should be developed, how it should be trained, that sort of thing. A suggestion, in effect, that democracy has a place downstream, not upstream. And some interestingly different answers about questions of accountability and liability. So we asked them, which is a potentially very radical statement to agree with. The people who create AI systems should be held responsible for the real-world impacts of those systems, right? This was at the time that Oppenheimer was in cinemas, right? A very old and important question of responsible innovation. And a surprising number of AI researchers express a desire to imagine responsibilities in those ways. Interestingly, so we separated on the benefits and risks question 2 groups out, pessimists and optimists. The pessimists are much, much more keen for this view of responsibility to play out in the world. Next one, and I think this is, again, this was important because this was a hugely important policy debate at the time. The question of changing copyright law in order to favor AI companies, in order to free them to be able to train on whatever data they come across. And what we saw was a really surprising degree of agreement between the public and between AI researchers on the need to care more, in effect, about training data. So this is not at all a sort of free-for-all where the AI researchers say, let us have everything, give it, right? Which is, if you like, the position that is put forward by some of the leading AI companies. And then just a final set of findings before I finish. So one other thing that we did in this survey is that we asked people in their own terms, so this is AI researchers, we're asking them in their own terms, what one thing worries you most about artificial intelligence? And then we categorized their responses in various ways. The first insight from this is that computer scientists are very bad at counting up to 1. Right? Almost all of them put more than one thing. But that's fine. We had multiple codes for things. What you can see, just to go back to the existential risk thing, that comes in pretty low down the list at sort of 3% of people. Adjacent ideas that will be familiar to some of you to do with alignment and control, again, only 4% of people. People are much more concerned about real-world uses, misuses, the misinformation, jobs, that sort of stuff, than they are about this existential risk question. And we were also able to run some correlations on those things. So, STS has a long history of being interested in gender and innovation questions. Really interesting applying a gender demographic correlation to this, and you find that women researchers, of whom there are not many in our sample, so less than a quarter of our sample are women, but they're more than twice as likely to worry about bias as men. And the people who answered yes to that is AGI inevitable question are much more likely to worry about existential risk in those sort of modes, which suggests that there's a sort of coherent story there. Okay, why is it worth doing this? Final point. It's worth doing this because I think we urgently need to improve the debate about artificial intelligence and its governance. There is this idea, and I think it's an idea that I hold on to, that science and scientists can act as the conscience of technology, which is an idea that originally comes from a guy called Harvey Brooks, and that the diversity that we see within our survey is a source of enrichment for a more productive debate on artificial intelligence. The messages that I think we can take from it are pretty simple ones. When you see hype, we absolutely shouldn't believe it, nor should we believe that it's what most people in the world of AI believe. Alan Turing, yes, I agree, a hero of computer science, but has done enormous damage to a debate about AI policy by cementing this idea that AI is actually about intelligence rather than about something else. Regulation should not wait and see, which the existential risk narrative asks us to do. Regulation should look for early warnings and seek to steer the technology in better ways at an early point, recognizing that a lot of what needs to happen, as I mentioned earlier, isn't just within the gift of AI companies. And we should urgently look at diversity. The fact that we hear from the same voices over and over and over again in the AI debate and hold those people as gurus, not just interested parties, is perhaps our biggest problem. I will finish there. Hopefully I've got a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
感谢杰克·斯蒂尔格教授的精彩分享。现在我们进入问答环节。如果各位观众有任何问题，请举手示意，工作人员会将麦克风递给您。谢谢。
Hi, Professor Stilgo. I think your presentation have given me more comprehensive understanding of the responsible technology. My question is, since the connection between AI research and commercialization have become increasingly close, from your research perspective, what's the difference between AI product managers and AI scientists in their understanding of responsible AI, especially regarding the obligations they themselves would undertake? And as the pioneers in the field of large model like OpenAI have also begun to develop ambitious applications like Sora, may I ask what factors you think can make these AI product managers better adhere the concept of responsible AI in the future?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really interesting, really interesting question. So let me step back and do another idea from science and technology studies that I find really useful. And it's an idea originally from a sociologist of technology called Donald Mackenzie. He had this idea, what he called the certainty trough. He said, often it's the people at one stage removed from a research area who are the most certain about a technology. And that actually, if you speak to the people working on it, the people aware of its contingencies, they are the people who are most uncertain. So one of the things we wanted to do with this survey was engage with the researchers in order to bring out some of that uncertainty. Because what we hear from the AI leaders is a huge amount of certainty, and it's been very effective certainty, very persuasive certainty, but it clearly doesn't reveal any of the sort of contingencies that we would regard as important. In terms of what that means then for AI researchers and AI product managers, and whether people who maybe entered into the field as AI researchers now find themselves doing something more like product management, and I think that shift has happened, and it's happened very quickly. It also engages with a really important debate about responsibility and about how responsibility is imagined differently by engineers and scientists historically, because those, they have different histories. Computer science has its own cultures of responsibility that play into this as well. I actually have a PhD student at the moment who's just been doing some work with AI product managers within companies, trying to ask them these questions of responsibility. And one of the things that she has found is a real degree of anxiety, a real degree of ambivalence about the work that they are involved in. And I think to extrapolate some of her work, some of what I would say about that is that they feel like their roles have changed quicker than they've been able to comprehend. And I think a lot of them have found themselves in the mode of product management, whereas they maybe entered as people, computer scientists either developing models or people interested in assessing these models. And I think if you compared it to something like the motor car, right, there is a difference in speed there. The motor car, we did have decades in order to understand what this thing meant, decades in order to understand what it meant to make these things safer, the difference between product development and product assessment and all the rest of it. But it's a really important dividing line. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk, and continue the motor car reference. Well, the tragic death of Senna, of course, changed the FIA just like retroactively changed the safety measures, the helmet, the neck rest, and everything. And what kind of signs do you think would similarly function as this like dramatic or catastrophic event for policymaking entities if there is this possibility of such a sign, or is it precisely the hard part of it that is so permissive in our society that we cannot really pick out a sign of the kind of incoming, Acropolis in a way?
Really good, right. So yeah, there's this idea, and it's sometimes referred to by aircraft engineers. They call it tombstone governance, right? Which is the idea that regulations change when people die. And almost we should give up on attempts to change regulation in the face of those very clear moments of societal awakening. I originally got into working on self-driving vehicles because of some very high-profile deaths, and have been really surprised at how little awakening has happened around that, in the way as, the analogy with Formula One does not seem to be playing out when it comes to self-driving vehicles. With generative AI, I think it's really interesting to think through what the early warnings have been, or what the early warnings might be. So the sorts of things that I see having slightly woken some people up out of their somnambulance have been things like prominent owners of copyright offering an objection to large language models. It was really notable that in Britain, the presumption that, copyright law will have to change in order to suit the AI companies was changed. That mood changed when people like Elton John kicked up a fuss. With more recently, more tragically, we've seen some stories about teenage suicides and emotional attachment. They're sort of, again, we were hearing some about that this morning. The coming to terms with these parasocial relationships that people might have with chatbots, and what that might mean, and the inadequacy of any regulation either within the system or around the system for dealing with some of that. How all of those things are also, as is the way in the US, being tied up in court cases. So how those court cases play out might prove consequential. But I do wonder. I think we need to do some scenario work to work out, well, what might those early warnings look like? What sort of things might we be wanting to look for in order to tune our governance a bit better?
Thank you, Professor. And I like your ideas of doing clinical trials to AI. So my question is, in terms of self-driving cars, we can have road test, so we can see if it's really safe or it's workable or not. We have some tests in Beijing, Yizhuang, or in Wuhan. But in terms of AI, compared with the more tangible technologies as self-driving cars, I think it seems to me that it's very hard to prevent people from using AI because it's so easily used and so easy to spread, and without any cost, or with very cheap cost. So I want to ask, in this situation, in what ways or what social experiments can we do to really test the responsibility of AI? Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, the first thing I would say is to appreciate, I think the language of social experimentation is very useful language for us to try to understand what might be at stake here. I mean, we should remember that with new medicines, after a series of public outrages, we now have the clinical trials apparatus that we have, right? We have had disastrous and awful and unethical experiments done on people without a clear public recognition of what's at stake, either ethically or in terms of the risks to their health. With AI, it's been notable that there's been very little conversation about what's at stake with the release of these models, right? So and that, I would say, is because of particular traditions of software, for example, in which software is released as an experimental project, explicitly experimental, and where the designers of software would say, well, the only way we know if it works is by testing it on everybody all at once. Right? It's just a different model. And because ultimately the realization was, well, if we release Windows and it's a bit buggy and your computer crashes, you restart your computer. That becomes a rather different thing if your car crashes and you're in it, or if your car crashes into somebody else, right? So what's at stake in those discussions is very different. So the discussion about self-driving vehicles and testing them, I mean, I did a few years ago, a few philosophers were making the argument about clinical trials for self-driving cars, and I said supportive things about them. And it was called the dumbest idea anybody's ever had, right? Because by some techno-libertarians who said, well, it will just slow down how quickly these things get out onto our streets. I mean, what we have seen de facto are forms of clinical trials, but they are forms of clinical trials where all of the governance is happening within companies, certainly within the US. It's slightly different in China. China's a really interesting example. A different governance model might be emerging. The big dividing line, I think, is about independent assessment. So an important early requirement of a clinical trial is that for it to be credible, for it to be trustworthy, the evidence was developed not by the company that are developing the technology, right? There needed to be independent assessments of these things happening. What we see with AI is very little of that sort of consideration. A lot of reliance upon, for example, companies' own internal safety testing, and then releasing what they call safety cards, just say, oh, we've, run some of these risks and we've convinced ourselves that actually this is probably fine. Right? What we haven't seen is any real independent testing. I think we are slowly building the apparatus for that independent testing. The criticism of we shouldn't let companies mark their own homework. But that apparatus still is, tiny compared to the apparatus that is developing these models and releasing them in a sort of permissionless way into the world.
Jack, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And there was one thing I was wondering, because you talk about a trial test, like clinical tests, but what if, the technology, information technology, once it's put into massive use, and it becomes intelligent, programmable, and as more and more people participated in the use of the technology, interact with the technology evolve and change, and there's no way, the nature of the technology decides there's no way to test it. So you can only do a post-hoc audit. Not necessarily independent, considering the fact that some of the basic digital infrastructures are developed in the collaboration between the government, the military, and the big platform companies. And independent auditing is, I think it's a problem in China. It's a different situation. But yeah, but on the other side, the inherent nature of the technology decides there's no prior clinical test.
Yeah. It's a really interesting challenge. So my starting point is to look for similarities with other technologies and how we govern them. But I think doing that in a well-informed way means engaging with the particularities of that technology. And I think your challenge is exactly the right one, right? Which is that maybe anything that we learn about a technology before its release would be, in effect, meaningless. Because it is only through the massive use and subsequent development of these technologies that change in use that we learn about what they mean. And I think there is, that would also be the challenge back to those people that were assessing the risks of a car, right? The risks of a car are profoundly, according to that argument, unknowable until you have, if you have 100 cars in your country, you're not going to know very much about what a car means. When you have millions of cars in your country and you've re-engineered the world around the car, you suddenly know some things.
Excuse me, but still for a car, you can test its robustness in a crash test, right?
Some things.
Yeah, you can test the resilience, the robustness of a software system in an extreme test, but then, yeah, you're right. I mean, the validity of the finding for these assessments is problematic if you put a real car into the real situation.
Yeah, yeah. And there is therefore an argument for adaptive governance, an argument for, I would say, acting on these early warnings and looking for these early warnings. Yeah, remember that crash tests for cars also came very late, right? After they had killed not just an awful lot of their own drivers, but an awful lot of children. And it was actually, interestingly, with cars, so to go back to this question of tombstone governance, it was the politics of risk to children that became the lever for political action. And I think we're already seeing with AI that children might be the way that interventions in governance can be justified. Certainly in the UK, that's been the case.
感谢教授的分享，谢谢。
Thank you very much.
今天的会议全部结束，感谢各位的参与。晚上9点至8点，我们将会进行放映讨论会，播放6点到8点，我们将会进行放映讨论会，播放迪伦·雷比林导演的作品《互联网的终结》。晚上8点至9点将有 Live Coding 开放式声音现场演出，欢迎大家前来参加。明天上午9点半，主论坛将继续进行，谢谢大家。